The forged orders from Himmler felt like a talisman against the encroaching chaos. They were my shield, granting me the authority I no longer officially possessed. While Hitler raged in his bunker, convinced of phantom armies and imminent counter-offensives, I focused on the only resource that still held tangible value: information. The archives of the Foreign Armies East, my life's work, and the most comprehensive intelligence collection on the Soviet Union in existence, had to be saved. The Führer had declared me a defeatist, but my true purpose was not to salvage his lost war. It was to salvage Germany's future. My transfer to the General's Reserve was the perfect cover. Officially, I was a man sidelined, awaiting a new, meaningless assignment. Unofficially, I used this ambiguity to orchestrate the most critical operation of my career. In the sprawling subterranean command center at Zossen, my most trusted subordinates, Lieutenant Colonels Hermann Baun and Gerhard Wessel, received their instructions in hushed tones. They understood the stakes immediately. This was not a retreat. It was a preservation. Over the next 72 hours, a silent, frantic effort consumed our section. Under the guise of preparing a special analysis on Polish resistance for the Reichsführer SS, a fiction so plausible in the paranoid atmosphere of the collapsing Reich that no one dared question it, we began to pack. The sum of our knowledge, millions of pages of reports, agent debriefings, intercepted signals, and strategic assessments, was condensed. Key documents were microfilmed, the spools carefully labeled and sealed. The rest, the irreplaceable core of the paper archive, was methodically placed into 50 watertight steel cases. Each case, when sealed, weighed over 100 pounds. They were not just containers of paper. They were 50 caskets carrying the ghost of the Eastern Front, each one a potential key to understanding the enemy who now stood at the gates of Berlin. The convoy of 3 trucks was assembled under the cover of a moonless, overcast night. I watched the last of the steel cases being loaded, the heavy thud of metal on the truck bed echoing the finality of our departure. My men, a hand-picked group of about 20 officers and senior NCOs, climbed aboard. Their faces were grim but resolute. They were not fleeing. They were guardians of a legacy, moving it from a tomb to a sanctuary. With a final quiet order, the engines turned over, and we slipped out of the Zossen complex, leaving the nerve center of the Wehrmacht to its inevitable demise. Our journey south, into the heart of a dying country, had begun. The road to the Bavarian Alps was a gauntlet of shattered infrastructure and prowling Allied fighter bombers, but it was the only path left. The journey south was a descent into the Reich's death agony. By day, we hid in dense woods, the trucks shrouded in camouflage netting, every man's ear tuned to the drone of Allied aircraft. By night, we navigated by starlight and memory, crawling along cratered roads that were little more than rubble-strewn tracks. At every town, we faced the gauntlet of checkpoints manned by suspicious, exhausted men, Volkssturm boys with fear in their eyes, or hard-faced SS officers looking for deserters. Himmler's forged orders were our only currency, a fragile piece of paper that held the power of life and death. More than once, a young lieutenant's hand hovered over his pistol as he scrutinized the signature, but the Reichsführer's authority, even in these final days, was a spell few dared to break. We reached our provisional sanctuary, a secluded country house near Cham in the Bavarian forest, just as the final collapse began. There, with the 50 steel cases stored securely in the deep cool of the wine cellars, I gathered my senior staff. The time for mere survival was over. The time for strategy had begun. I laid out the plan, one that had already received the cautious blessing of General Winter, and through him the future head of state, Admiral Dönitz. We would not surrender our intelligence. We would offer it. The Americans, I argued, were strategically naive about the Soviet Union. They saw an ally. We saw the next existential threat. Our archives were the price of admission to a new, undeclared war, the one that would truly matter. Our service would be the foundation for a future, sovereign Germany, resurrected to stand as a bulwark against communist expansion. The consensus was immediate and absolute. We were no longer officers of a doomed army, but custodians of a future one. The next steps were executed with cold precision. We divided into 3 groups, each self-sufficient, each tasked with disappearing into the high alpine wilderness. The microfilm, our most compact and vital asset, was duplicated. One set was buried in specially prepared caches near the peak of the Wendelstein, another far to the west in the Hunsrück Hills. If one team was caught, the knowledge would survive. As my men melted into the mountains, I received word that sealed my own fate. The SS had issued a liquidation order for me. My defeatism had finally been judged as treason. I made my way to a remote hunting cabin, the appropriately named Elendhütte, Misery Lodge, near the Austrian border. There, surrounded by the silent peaks, I began to wait for the war to end and for the Americans to come looking for the ghosts of the Eastern Front. Life at the Elend Lodge became a rhythm of fear and defiance. Each dawn, we would leave the relative comfort of the cabin and begin the arduous climb higher into the mountains. The air grew thin, our lungs burning with the effort, but the peaks offered a sanctuary the valley could not. We found a small, sheltered meadow, a natural amphitheater of rock and pine, from which we could watch the roads below. From this vantage point, the war's end was an abstract spectacle, the distant rumble of explosions, the occasional plume of smoke rising from a village. Spring bloomed around us with a savage indifference. Wild crocuses pushed through the last patches of snow, and the scent of pine filled the air, a surreal counterpoint to the stench of a dying nation. One afternoon, our vigil was shattered. We descended to find the lodge occupied. A small patrol from an American infantry unit had found us. They were young, barely out of their teens, their faces a mixture of suspicion and exhaustion. They swept through the cabin with a clumsy efficiency, their rifles held ready. We stood with our hands raised, the female assistants pale but composed, the officers and I projecting a calm we did not feel. They questioned us, their German rough and functional. Who were we? What were we doing here? We presented our doctored discharge papers, claiming to be demobilized staff from a disbanded meteorological unit. The story was thin, but in the chaos of a collapsed front, it was plausible enough. They took a few of the younger men away for further questioning, leaving the rest of us under a loose form of house arrest, a temporary reprieve. The encounter hardened our resolve. We could no longer rely on the lodge alone. As the days grew warmer, we established a more permanent camp in a dense glade of fir trees, a half-hour's climb from the cabin. We lived between 2 worlds, the provisional prison of the lodge and the hidden freedom of the forest. But this existence was unsustainable. By late May, the sporadic patrols had become a more organized occupation. The time for hiding was over. To wait to be found was to cede control, to become just another piece of human debris washed up by the war. We had to act, to present ourselves on our own terms, to initiate the plan we had sacrificed everything for. In the dim light of the cabin, we made our final preparations. With small knives and thread cutters, We began to strip our uniforms, carefully removing the crimson stripes of the general staff and the silver eagles from our tunics. We would descend not as conquerors or as the vanquished, but as something else entirely, men with a secret to sell, walking out of the wilderness and into a new, uncertain world. The descent was more perilous than the climb. We moved as a scattered group of civilians, our stripped uniforms now resembling shabby hiking attire. Every shadow held a potential threat. Near the lower Schönfeld Alp, we heard the sharp, unfamiliar sound of French voices, a mountain unit, far from their usual operational areas, combing the peaks. We slowed our pace, affecting an air of weary indifference, like locals out searching for firewood. We nodded as we passed, our hearts hammering against our ribs. They watched us, their gazes lingering, but the sheer mundanity of our appearance was our best defense. They let us go, and we melted back into the tree line, the tension breaking only when we were a kilometer distant. Down in the valley, the American presence was overwhelming. Jeeps and trucks churned up dust on the roads, and military police patrols were everywhere, their white helmets and armbands a constant reminder of our new reality. We skirted the main routes, using goat paths and farm tracks, until we reached the village of Fischhausen and the designated safe house, the home of Major Schurer's parents. For 3 days, we hid in their attic, living on black bread and water, listening to the sounds of the occupation filter up through the floorboards. It was a purgatory between two lives. On the 4th day, we walked out into the sunlight and surrendered to a patrol from the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps. The transition was immediate and jarring. We were no longer officers of the German General Staff, but prisoners, albeit valuable ones. The interrogations began, first at a local command post, then at a more secure facility. I was separated from my men, my identity a closely guarded secret. I was no longer Reinhard Gehlen. I was a source, an asset to be evaluated. Weeks turned into months. The journey culminated not in a prison camp, but in a transatlantic flight. I was flown to Washington, to Fort Hunt, where the questions became more specific, more strategic. I laid out what I knew, what my organization had gathered, and what I proposed for the future. I spoke of the Soviet order of battle, of their political intentions, of the inevitability of the conflict to come. They listened. When I returned to Germany in July 1946, it was to a different world. The plane landed near Frankfurt, and I was driven to the Ober-Ursel compound, a place I had known before the war. It was now an American interrogation center, repurposed for the new era. As I walked through the gates, I saw familiar faces: Wessel, Baun. My entire senior staff was there, gathered from POW camps across the country. They had been found and brought here to meet me. The Americans had not just listened, they had acted. We were all together again, not as prisoners, but as partners. In the sterile briefing rooms of Oberursel, surrounded by the remnants of our defeated army, we began the quiet, meticulous work of building a new intelligence service from the ashes of the old. The war was over, but our war was just beginning. The formal interrogations gave way to something else entirely: strategic discussions. In a Spartan conference room at Oberursel, the dynamic shifted from prisoner and captor to that of professionals assessing a shared and rapidly escalating threat. The man who embodied this change was Brigadier General Edwin Seibert, the G2, the senior intelligence officer for the American Zone. He was a career soldier, pragmatic and clear-eyed, a man who saw the world not through the lens of past enmities, but of future dangers. In him, I found a mind that understood the true nature of the victory in Europe. It was not an end, but a realignment. The front had not vanished. It had merely shifted eastward. Our conversations culminated in a final, decisive meeting. There were no stenographers, no aides. It was just the two of us, two intelligence chiefs representing a defeated nation and a victorious one, sitting across a simple wooden table. I laid out my conditions, not as demands, but as the only logical foundation for a viable partnership. I stated plainly that my men and I were not mercenaries to be hired out. We would work with the Americans, not for them. This had to be a German organization, under German leadership, dedicated to the single purpose of gathering intelligence on the Soviet Union and its expansionist aims. It was to be the clandestine shield for a defenseless Germany. Cyber listened, his gaze unwavering, occasionally nodding as if I were merely articulating thoughts he had already formed himself. I continued, outlining the framework. Our funding must come from the United States, but it had to be administered separately from the general occupation costs, a crucial distinction that preserved our operational autonomy. Most importantly, I stipulated that when a new, sovereign German government was one day formed, this entire organization, its personnel, its files, its operations, would be transferred to its control. We were building a German asset, temporarily entrusting it to American guardianship. Finally, I made it clear that should American and German interests ever diverge, our primary loyalty would be to Germany. He considered this for a long moment, the silence in the room thick with the weight of unspoken history. Then he extended his hand across the table. "General," he said, his voice firm, "we have an agreement." We shook hands. There was no treaty, no contract signed in triplicate. It was a verbal pact, a gentleman's agreement, founded on a shared perception of reality and a mutual, professional trust that transcended the uniforms we had worn just months before. In that handshake, the gamble I had taken in the dying days of the Reich found its justification. The 50 steel cases buried in the Alpine wilderness had served their purpose. They were not just an archive to be traded, but the seed from which a new German defense and a new role in the world would grow. The handshake with Seibert was the conception. The birth of our organization was a far messier affair. We began our work inside the very wire fences that held us, a clandestine unit camouflaged as just another group of denazification subjects and high-value prisoners within the Oberursel compound. The irony was a strategic asset. To any Soviet agents watching, we were simply remnants of a defeated military being processed. In reality, we were a government in exile of intelligence professionals, laying the foundations for a new front in a war that had not yet been declared. The first cracks appeared not from outside pressure, but from within. Hermann Baun, my former head of evaluation, had been a brilliant analyst, but he lacked a strategic mind. He had been picked up by the Americans before me and had initiated his own small-scale intelligence-gathering efforts. Now, subsumed into the larger structure, he bristled under my authority. He saw our enterprise as a technical matter of agent running and procurement, a continuation of our old work under a new paymaster. He could not grasp the political dimension, the delicate balance of the gentleman's agreement, the necessity of absolute unity, and the long-term goal of creating a sovereign German service. His dissent crystallized around his demand for an independent procurement agency, a network for acquiring resources and paying agents that he alone would control. It was a bid for a private fiefdom, and it was an existential threat to the organization. A fragmented command would make us vulnerable to American manipulation and internal collapse. I could not allow it. Our arguments were quiet but intense, fought in the cramped confines of our barracks office. He saw my insistence on centralized control as a power grab. I saw his ambition as a poison that would destroy our one chance to rebuild. This internal friction was compounded by the daily nightmare of logistics. We operated in a country without a currency, using US dollars that were illegal for Germans to possess. Every transaction was a black market risk. Our operatives needed identity papers, travel permits, ration cards, all of which had to be expertly forged under the noses of our American hosts, particularly the ever-suspicious Counterintelligence Corps, who viewed every German as a potential security threat. We were simultaneously partners and prisoners. In 1947, the conflict with Baun reached its breaking point. With Seibert's reluctant backing, I removed him from his post. It was a painful but necessary amputation. Despite the chaos, the betrayals, and the scarcity, our networks began to grow. From the rubble of a dead Reich, agent by agent, report by report, we were building something new. By late 1947, the raw intelligence flowing from our networks had evolved. It was no longer confined to the disposition of Red Army divisions or the readiness of their tank parks. Our agents, recruited from the displaced and dispossessed of Eastern Europe, now delivered reports on factory outputs in Silesia, political purges in Prague, and the technical specifications of new Soviet radar installations. My original concept of a unified service, one that treated the communist threat as a monolithic entity to be analyzed in its political, economic, and military dimensions, was being validated with every coded message we received. We were becoming the West's central nervous system for all information east of the Elbe. This success, however, was built on a foundation that had begun to shift beneath our feet. Our staunchest American advocates, General Seibert and his trusted subordinate Colonel Dean, were reassigned. They were men of the old war, soldiers who understood the value of our unwritten pact. Their replacements were of a different breed. The new liaison, a Colonel Lewis, was a bureaucrat, a man who saw assets, not allies. He viewed the gentleman's agreement not as a strategic partnership, but as a temporary and perhaps inconvenient employment contract. The friction was immediate. Requests for resources were met with suspicion, and our operational autonomy was subtly but consistently challenged. We were no longer partners in a shared cause. We were becoming subordinates, expected to justify our existence through a constant stream of quantifiable results. The precariousness of our position was a daily reality. Secrecy was absolute, a multi-layered defense against a host of enemies. We had to shield our agents from the formidable reach of Soviet counterintelligence, which was actively hunting them across the divided continent. We also had to guard our operations from the prying eyes of rival Allied services, the British and the French, who would have seen our German-led organization as a dangerous anomaly to be dismantled. Every operative, every source, every piece of information was a secret held in a fragile balance, protected only by our own discipline and the grudging support of our American sponsors. Despite the internal tensions and external threats the organization endured, it grew stronger, its roots sinking deeper into the soil of the new conflict. The desperate gamble conceived in the final fiery days of the Reich had succeeded beyond my most optimistic projections. We had survived the collapse, the internment, the internal power struggles, and the shifting loyalties of our patrons. We were no longer a handful of fugitive officers guarding 50 steel cases of files. We were a functioning indispensable instrument of a new and undeclared war, the first permanent weapon of the Cold War, forged in the ruins of Germany,